The machines are still there. Walk into the old American Tobacco campus on West Corporation Street today, and, if you know where to look, past the boutique restaurants and the craft brewery and the co-working spaces with exposed brick walls. You can still find them, rusted, bolted to floors that haven't felt the vibration of production in 40 years. These aren't museum pieces. Nobody brought them here to be displayed. They were simply too heavy to move, too embedded in the concrete to extract without demolishing the building itself. So they stayed. Monuments to a production operation so vast, so dominant, so seemingly permanent, that even its physical remnants proved impossible to fully erase. At its peak, the American Tobacco Company's Durham facility employed 12,000 people. 12,000 human beings working 3 shifts around the clock, producing numbers that don't feel real until you slow down and think about them. More than 200 billion cigarettes a year rolling off these machines and into the hands of American consumers. The facility stretched across more than 50 acres of urban Durham, a city within a city, its own water supply, its own fire department, its own internal railroad network connecting building to building. Then, in less than a decade, it was gone. Not slowly, not gracefully. Gone the way structures collapse, holding, and then all at once. The question that keeps pulling at you, once you start looking at what actually happened here, isn't why the tobacco industry declined. That part is straightforward. The question is why Durham collapsed when other tobacco cities didn't. Why the company that built Lucky Strike, the most recognizable cigarette brand on earth, ultimately became the instrument of its own city's destruction. And why the people who ran this operation, some of the most sophisticated businessmen in America, didn't see it coming until the city was already half empty. This is a story about automation, about the moment a company chose machines over people, and what happens to a place when 12,000 livelihoods vanish, not in a market crash or a war or a natural disaster, but in a deliberate, calculated, board-approved decision made in a conference room in New York City. James Buchanan Duke was born in a log cabin on the Eno River in Orange County, North Carolina, in December of 1856. His father, Washington Duke, had fought, reluctantly, for the Confederacy, returned from the war with 50 cents in his pocket and a barn full of bright leaf tobacco, and turned that tobacco into a modest processing operation that he ran with his 3 sons. Buck Duke, as everyone called him, was not modest. There's a specific scene from his early life that tells you almost everything you need to know about who this man was. He was 9 years old when the Civil War ended. His father's farm had been looted by Union soldiers. Both sides looted freely, it should be noted. And what remained was a wagon, 2 mules, and some processed tobacco. Washington Duke loaded the wagon and walked from Raleigh to his home farm, selling tobacco door to door along the way. He brought his children with him. Buck Duke walked that road as a small boy and watched his father negotiate with strangers, exchange product for coins, and move to the next door. The education was complete, and it lasted a lifetime. By his late 20s, Buck Duke had concluded something that nobody else in the American tobacco industry had quite articulated. Tobacco was not a premium product requiring premium marketing. It was a commodity product requiring industrial-scale production. The man who could make the most cigarettes, the fastest, at the lowest cost per unit, would own the market. Not the man with the best tobacco. Not the man with the finest rolling technique. The man with the best machine. In 1881, when Buck Duke was 24 years old, he heard about a mechanical cigarette rolling machine invented by James Bonsack, a device that could produce 120,000 cigarettes a day compared to the 3,000 that a skilled hand roller could manage. The established tobacco companies looked at the Bonsack machine and saw a gimmick. The cigarettes it produced were slightly inconsistent. The machinery was temperamental. The established players were doing fine with their skilled workers and their premium reputations. Duke signed an exclusive licensing deal with Bonsack. He hired a mechanic named William O'Brien specifically to master the machine's maintenance. Within 2 years, he had 5 Bonsack machines running, producing cigarettes at 1/3 the cost of his nearest competitor. I find this particular decision genuinely fascinating to examine. Not because it was bold, but because everyone else had the same information and reached the opposite conclusion. What did Duke see that they didn't? Probably this: that consumers, given a choice between a cigarette that cost less and a cigarette that cost more, would eventually stop caring about marginal quality differences. He was right. Catastrophically, presciently right. By 1890, Duke had consolidated 5 of the largest tobacco companies in America into the American Tobacco Company, a trust that controlled 91% of the domestic cigarette market. He was 33 years old. The choice of Durham was not accidental, and understanding why Duke chose this particular patch of North Carolina clay explains much of what came later. Durham in the 1870s was barely a town. It had incorporated in 1869, not because it had any particular civic ambition, but because it needed a name for a train station on the North Carolina Railroad. The surrounding region grew bright leaf tobacco, a variety of cured leaf that had been popular since before the Civil War, and whose distinctive golden color came from a wood fire curing process that farmers in Person and Granville counties had more or less accidentally discovered decades earlier. Washington Duke had established his factory in Durham in 1874 with initial capital of roughly $30,000, approximately $800,000 in today's terms. Modest enough to finance a serious operation in that era, but nothing like the industrial ambitions that would follow. The climate helped. Durham's humidity made tobacco processing more predictable. The railroad connection helped. The town sat at the intersection of lines that could move raw leaf in and finished product out. The labor supply helped. The post-war South had an enormous population of workers, both black and white, with few alternatives. By the time the American Tobacco Company formally consolidated in 1890, Durham's identity was complete. The town didn't have tobacco, the town was tobacco. The company's payroll accounted for more than half of all formal employment in the county. The company's tax payments funded the municipal government. The company's donations built hospitals, schools, and Trinity College, which would later, with continued Duke money, become Duke University. What's crucial to understand about this founding period is what it established economically: a single employer relationship between a corporation and an entire city. Durham didn't have a diversified industrial base that happened to include tobacco. Durham had tobacco and almost nothing else. Every merchant, every landlord, every service business, every church, every school, all of it existed in the gravitational field of the factory. When the American Tobacco Company thrived, Durham thrived. The logic ran in one direction only, and for a long time nobody in Durham found any reason to question it. In 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States ordered the dissolution of the American Tobacco Company under the Sherman Antitrust Act. What had taken 2 decades to assemble was dismantled by judicial order in one ruling. The breakup produced 14 separate companies. The reconstituted American Tobacco Company retained the Lucky Strike brand and the Durham manufacturing facilities. R.J. Reynolds, based in Winston-Salem, retained Camel. Liggett and Myers kept Chesterfield. The giants of 20th century American tobacco had been born from the wreckage of Buck Duke's monopoly. Here's the thing about the 1911 breakup that never gets discussed in the standard narrative. It was the best thing that ever happened to the tobacco industry. Not despite its intent, but because of what it produced: competition. Real competition for the first time in decades forced each of the successor companies to innovate, to market, to develop brand identities that could sustain consumer loyalty without the crutch of monopoly pricing. Lucky Strike, under the reconstituted American Tobacco Company, became the first cigarette brand to be genuinely, systematically marketed to American women. A campaign in the late 1920s and early 1930s that used the slogan, "Reach for a Lucky instead of a Sweet," and positioned cigarette smoking as a tool of female emancipation and weight management simultaneously. It was cynical. It was brilliant. It worked. By 1930, Lucky Strike was the best-selling cigarette in America, commanding roughly 38% of the national market. The Durham factories were running 3 shifts. The payroll had expanded to accommodate new workers, black workers primarily, because the American Tobacco Company employed black labor for the manufacturing floor in numbers that few Southern industries matched, even as it maintained rigidly segregated working conditions. This distinction matters, and we'll return to it. The Durham facility in this period was nothing less than extraordinary by the standards of its time. The main manufacturing building on West Corporation Street, a structure that still stands today, converted to offices, was 5 stories of reinforced concrete covering nearly an acre per floor, steam heat in winter, forced ventilation in summer, a company cafeteria serving subsidized meals, a company nurse, an employee credit union. These were not philanthropic gestures. They were investments in retention for a workforce that possessed specialized skills and for whom high turnover would have cost the company enormously. To put the scale in physical perspective, the American Tobacco campus generated enough heat from its manufacturing processes to warm the buildings entirely from waste energy. The complex consumed water at rates that required its own dedicated pumping infrastructure from the Eno River. Delivery wagons, and later trucks, moved in and out of the loading docks at a pace that kept an entire neighborhood in permanent gridlock during shift changes. This was, in every measurable sense, the center of the American tobacco universe. The Second World War transformed American tobacco's relationship with its own product in ways that would shape everything that followed. Cigarettes were included in American military rations beginning in 1942. The logic was straightforward. Cigarettes calmed nerves, occupied hands, provided the small comfort of a ritual during conditions that were otherwise utterly without comfort. The military bought cigarettes by the billion and sent them to every theater of the war. Lucky Strike's green-colored packaging was changed to white in 1942 under the slogan "Lucky Strike Green has gone to war." Nominally because the green dye was needed for military use, but primarily as a marketing opportunity that the company executed with extraordinary skill. American Tobacco's president, George Washington Hill, understood something that his competitors were slower to grasp. The war was not an interruption to their business. It was the most effective mass sampling campaign in history. Millions of young American men, many of whom had never smoked before enlisting, were handed cigarettes as part of their daily military allotment. Some would have developed the habit regardless. Many would not have. But they developed it anyway, under the most psychologically conditioning circumstances possible. And when they came home, they brought the habit with them. By 1945, per capita cigarette consumption in the United States had reached 3,449 cigarettes per person per year, roughly 10 cigarettes a day for every adult American. Think about what that actually meant for Durham. The 12,000 people on the factory floor were producing product that was not merely popular, but physiologically demanded by an enormous share of the adult population. The market, at that moment, appeared structurally indestructible. George Washington Hill died in 1946, having presided over the most profitable decade in the company's history. His successors inherited an operation that was generating money at a rate that made serious cost analysis almost impossible to take seriously. When everything is working, it is very difficult to see what isn't working. When your market share is measured in the hundreds of billions of units, it is very difficult to read the signals that suggest your market share is about to become a liability rather than an asset. The seeds of what came next were planted in those post-war years of abundance, when the numbers were too good to question and the warnings were too quiet to hear. January 1954. The American public was reading a document that nobody in the tobacco industry had wanted published, and that would take another decade to fully process, but that had already set in motion something irreversible. The document was a summary of research, compiled and published by Reader's Digest, describing the scientific consensus that was forming around a single devastating conclusion. Cigarettes caused lung cancer. The Reader's Digest piece, titled "Cancer by the Carton," was not the first publication on this subject, and it was not the most detailed. But it reached the most people, in the most accessible terms, at the moment when the post-war American public was most receptive. The tobacco companies responded with a strategy that has since become one of the most analyzed crisis communications campaigns in corporate history. They hired scientists, created research institutes, flooded publications with counterclaims, and attacked the credibility of every study that confirmed the link. The strategy worked, but only partially, and only for a time. It bought the industry 15 or 20 years of continued growth in absolute terms, during which per capita consumption actually continued to rise even as doubts accumulated. But it could not indefinitely sustain what the science was making increasingly indefensible. What the crisis response did do, with great precision, was accelerate a particular internal logic within the tobacco companies, the imperative to reduce costs. If the market was going to face headwinds, the companies that survived would be those that could produce the most cigarettes at the lowest cost per unit. If revenue growth was going to slow, the way to maintain profitability was to squeeze the cost side of the equation. And the largest cost in cigarette manufacturing, by a substantial margin, was labor. I think this is the moment where the story of Durham's decline really begins, even though the visible consequences wouldn't arrive for another 20 years. The decision to pursue automation to replace human workers with machines didn't emerge from anti-labor ideology or simple greed. It emerged from a rational, defensible, board-level conclusion that labor was the variable that needed controlling. That conclusion was correct. The consequences were irreversible. Before we reach the automation story, we have to spend time in a part of the Durham narrative that usually gets compressed or omitted: the role of black workers in building and sustaining the tobacco economy, and why their particular position in the factory made them the first and hardest casualties of what came next. The American Tobacco Company in Durham employed black workers at rates that were genuinely unusual for the industrial South of the early and mid-20th century. At the facility's peak, African Americans represented more than 60% of the manufacturing workforce, not in skilled or supervisory roles, but in the specific manual processes that form the core of cigarette production: stemming, sorting, conditioning, and the grinding physical labor of feeding raw tobacco into the manufacturing process. This arrangement was not progressive, it was economic. The work was hot, dusty, and physically demanding in ways that made respiratory illness a near certain occupational outcome for long-term employees. The company paid wages that were below what white workers in comparable industrial jobs earned elsewhere in the state. The segregated facilities, separate bathrooms, separate cafeterias, separate water fountains, visible in photographs through the 1950s, made clear the company's view of what it owed to these workers. And yet, for Black Durham, The American Tobacco Company represented economic opportunity unavailable almost anywhere else in the South. The wages, however inadequate, were regular and formal. The sheer scale of employment, thousands of jobs, in walking distance of the historically black neighborhoods of East Durham, created a self-sustaining community. Haiti, the black commercial district that developed in Durham in the first half of the 20th century, was built on tobacco wages. The churches, the businesses, the schools, the insurance companies, all of it rested on the same foundation. North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, founded in Durham in 1898 and eventually the largest black-owned business in America, grew in direct relationship to the tobacco workforce it insured. Durham was called the Black Wall Street, a phrase more often associated with Tulsa, Oklahoma, but applied to Durham by Booker T. Washington himself. And the source of that capital was the American Tobacco Company factory floor. What happens to that community when the factory floor empties? We're about to find out. The Honey GD machine arrived in Durham in 1962. It was German-engineered, technically precise, and capable of producing 2,500 cigarettes per minute. One machine, 2,500 cigarettes per minute. To understand what this number meant in practice, consider the arithmetic. A skilled manual worker in tobacco processing could handle approximately 300 pounds of tobacco per day as part of a team involved in stemming and preparation. The Honey machine and its successors required one operator and one maintenance technician to oversee a process that had previously employed dozens of workers per shift. The company didn't make the automation decision in a single year or in a single announcement. It was made the way most large corporate decisions are made. Incrementally, defensively, one budget cycle at a time, with each individual step appearing modest and rational, while the cumulative effect was seismic. In 1960, American Tobacco employed approximately 10,000 people in Durham across its various facilities. By 1965, that number was 8,500. Machine-assisted production was improving efficiency. Some retirement and attrition was not being replaced. Nothing dramatic. By 1970, 6,400. The company was consolidating processes. The labor-intensive stemming operations were being restructured. Some work was being moved to other facilities. Each year's layoffs were explained individually as operational adjustments. By 1975, 4,100. The trend was now impossible to miss, but the company's communications remained consistent. The industry was facing headwinds. Productivity improvements were necessary. The Durham facility remained strategically important to American Tobacco's operations. By 1980, fewer than 2,000. The facility that had employed 12,000 people at its mid-century peak was now operating with 1/6 of its workforce, producing comparable or greater volumes of product. This is, in retrospect, a remarkably fast destruction of a city's economic foundation. 10 years from peak employment to marginal employment, in a city where the industrial base had never diversified, where the tax base was entirely cigarette dependent, where the civic infrastructure, schools, hospitals, roads, had been built to serve a population economically sustained by those 12,000 paychecks. The consequences compounded in every direction simultaneously. What I find genuinely striking about this timeline is how rational each individual decision appears in isolation. No single year's layoffs would have appeared in a board presentation as anything other than necessary and responsible management of a challenged business. The catastrophe was invisible in the individual decisions and visible only in the aggregate. This is, incidentally, a pattern that appears again and again in industrial history, and in corporate histories far more recent than this one. By 1985, the American Tobacco Company had effectively ceased to be a Durham story. The company itself had become a subsidiary of American Brands, which had diversified aggressively into non-tobacco products, Titleist golf balls, Jim Beam bourbon, Sunshine biscuits, precisely because its strategic leadership understood that the cigarette business was a managed decline requiring cash extraction, not a growth business requiring reinvestment. The Durham facilities were not a priority. They were a legacy asset on a balance sheet, evaluated in terms of what could be extracted rather than what could be built. The city that the tobacco economy had built faced a reckoning it was structurally unprepared for. Property tax revenue collapsed as the factory's assessed value declined. The city government, which had built its municipal infrastructure around a tax base anchored by the American tobacco complex, faced deficits that required either service cuts or tax increases on a population whose income was also collapsing. Small businesses that had served 12,000 factory workers, the diners, the convenience stores, the bars, the laundromats, lost their customer base. Haiti, the historic black commercial district, had already been partially destroyed by urban renewal in the 1960s, and the tobacco employment decline completed what urban renewal had begun. By 1987, West Durham along the Eno corridor had vacancy rates in commercial property that exceeded 40%. The mill housing, the rows of company-adjacent rental units that had housed tobacco workers for 3 generations, was deteriorating faster than the tax base could support repair or the private market could justify investment. Durham acquired a reputation in this period that stuck to it for 2 decades. A post-industrial city with a crime problem, a school system under fiscal stress, and a downtown that felt hollowed out in ways that were visible from the highway. The Research Triangle, the academic-industrial complex linking Duke University, UNC Chapel Hill, and NC State, was already growing in the suburbs and in Raleigh and Chapel Hill, but in the 1970s and 1980s, it had not yet created the kind of urban density that would eventually revitalize downtown Durham. The benefits of the Triangle's growth were landing in places other than the neighborhoods that most needed them. The 12,000 workers didn't disappear. They remained in Durham, older, less employable in the new economy that was emerging, with skills that the market for which they'd been trained had simply eliminated. The industrial job that paid a living wage without a college degree, the backbone of American working-class economic mobility throughout the mid-20th century, had in Durham been specifically and efficiently replaced by machinery. American Tobacco formally ceased manufacturing operations at the Durham facility in 1987. The last cigarette rolled off the Durham line sometime in the spring of that year. There was no ceremony, no announcement to the press, no acknowledgement that anything significant was ending. The machinery was decommissioned, the buildings were secured, the campus went quiet. The closure was, in financial terms, entirely defensible. The company's production had been consolidated into more modern, more automated facilities elsewhere. The Durham campus, with its aging multi-story buildings and its legacy infrastructure, was not competitive on a per-unit cost basis with newer single-story manufacturing plants designed around automation from the ground up. The decision was correct, in narrow accounting terms, the way many decisions that devastate communities are correct in narrow accounting terms. What the decision did not account for, what corporate decisions rarely account for, was the full ledger. Not just the cost per unit of production, but the cost to a city of losing its primary employer. Not just the efficiency gains from automation, but the tax revenue lost, the social services required, the community institutions defunded, the human capital degraded across a generation. American Tobacco's successor companies paid no reparations to Durham. They were under no legal obligation to do so. They left behind buildings, some environmental contamination from decades of tobacco processing, and a workforce that the market had rendered overnight obsolete. The company that had built Duke University, funded Durham's hospitals, provided 3 generations of working-class employment. That company left. And what it left behind was a city that had never learned to exist without it. Here's what gets lost in the macro-level story, the individual scale. A woman who had stemmed tobacco for American tobacco for 22 years, who was 51 years old in 1987, who had raised 3 children on that income, who had never needed to look for another job in her adult life. What was her path forward? The retraining programs that were discussed and partially funded and mostly inadequate could not convert 20 years of tobacco-specific manual skill into the kind of employability the new research triangle economy was demanding. The economy wanted young, educated, technically literate. It had limited use for experienced, physically capable, and specifically skilled in processes that no longer existed. 4 things stand out from this story, each of which extends well beyond the specific circumstances of Durham and the American Tobacco Company. The first lesson is about the single company city. Durham's fundamental vulnerability was created long before the automation decision. It was created in the founding moment when the tobacco industry became the only serious economic activity in the city. This is not a mistake specific to the 19th century. Single-employer towns continue to be created whenever a major corporation becomes the dominant force in a regional economy without deliberate diversification policy counteracting the natural gravitational pull. The Detroit metropolitan area. Gary, Indiana. Erie, Pennsylvania. The pattern is remarkably consistent. A corporation grows to dominate a regional economy. The region builds its infrastructure around that corporation's payroll. The corporation eventually faces competitive pressure that it resolves by reducing labor, and the region discovers that it built its future on a foundation that belonged to someone else. American Tobacco's competitors in Winston-Salem, R.J. Reynolds, made similar automation decisions over a similar timeline, and Winston-Salem experienced similar employment decline. The difference was that Winston-Salem had developed a somewhat more diversified industrial base and, more importantly, had a corporate culture at Reynolds that invested in regional development more broadly. The community impact was severe there too. It was not as severe as Durham. The second lesson is about the invisibility of incremental decisions. The automation of the Durham facility did not happen in a single dramatic board meeting. It happened in 12 consecutive annual budget cycles, each of which looked internally defensible. The company's leadership was not making a decision to destroy Durham. They were making a decision to improve per-unit economics repeatedly for over a decade. The consequences accumulated invisibly became visible only when they were already irreversible. And at no point did any single decision trigger the kind of stakeholder scrutiny that the cumulative decision, understood in its totality, would certainly have generated. This pattern, catastrophic consequences emerging from individually defensible incremental decisions, is arguably the defining challenge of corporate governance in industries undergoing technological transition. It's no easier to see today than it was in 1965. If anything, it's harder because the pace of technological change has accelerated while the timescales for policy response have not. The third lesson is about who pays for efficiency gains. The honey machine was more efficient than the workers it replaced. That efficiency gain, measured in lower cost per unit, in higher operating margins, in capital returns to American Brand's shareholders, was real. The question that the corporation's accounting did not ask is, efficient for whom? The efficiency gain accrued to shareholders. The cost of the efficiency gain, unemployment, community decline, degraded civic infrastructure, generational poverty, was borne by Durham. The workers who had made the American Tobacco Company profitable for 3 generations received no share of the productivity gains their displacement had made possible. This is not an argument against automation. Automation creates wealth, and on a long enough time horizon, that wealth tends to diffuse through the economy in ways that improve aggregate living standards. But the time horizon over which automation's benefits diffuse is measured in generations. The time horizon over which automation's costs arrive is measured in fiscal quarters. The workers of Durham did not live on the long time horizon. They lived on the short one. The fourth lesson is specific to Durham and to race. The black workers, who form the majority of American Tobacco's manufacturing workforce, were the first to lose their jobs as automation advanced, because they were concentrated in the manual processes that machines replaced first. They had no union protection comparable to what white industrial workers in the North were negotiating. They had no severance packages calibrated to the length of their service. They had no pension vesting that protected retirement income after displacement. They lost their jobs, and then they watched the commercial district that their wages had built, Heidi, decline over the following decade in ways from which it has never fully recovered. The civil rights movement had, by the 1970s, opened formal legal pathways that had not existed before. But legal formal equality and economic opportunity are different things. And in Durham in 1975, the economic opportunity that had provided the material foundation for black civic life was being systematically eliminated by machines. The parallel isn't subtle. The tobacco industry had benefited from black labor for a century under exploitative conditions, and when it found a way to eliminate that labor, it did so without hesitation or compensation. Walk through the American Tobacco campus today, and what you see is genuinely impressive. The campus was redeveloped in the early 2000s, anchored by an investment from developer Greg Hatem that converted the historic buildings into restaurants, offices, and entertainment venues. The Durham Bulls Athletic Park sits adjacent. A boutique hotel occupies what was once a warehouse. A craft brewery operates in a building where tobacco was once conditioned in humidity-controlled chambers. The development has won architectural awards. It draws visitors. It has become, in travel writing, an example of successful adaptive reuse. The Lucky Strike water tower still stands at the northeast corner of the campus, white, restored, lit at night. The brand name that once represented the industrial apex of American tobacco production now functions as a vintage aesthetic element, a piece of visual history that adds character to an entertainment district. American Tobacco Company itself ceased to exist as an independent entity through a series of mergers and acquisitions that concluded when British American Tobacco acquired its final remnants in 1994. Lucky Strike cigarettes are still manufactured in factories in various countries, in quantities that are a fraction of what Durham once produced, and still sold in markets around the world. The brand that George Washington Hill built, that the Durham factories sustained, persists as a minor player in a global market that has restructured entirely around it. Durham itself has, by many measures, recovered. Downtown Durham is, as of the past decade, one of the more vibrant small city downtowns in the American South. Duke University's continued growth as a research institution has anchored an innovation economy. The Research Triangle has attracted pharmaceutical and technology employers. Property values in many Durham neighborhoods have risen substantially. But recovery is not restoration, and the communities that bore the weight of the tobacco economy's collapse did not benefit equally from its successor economy's growth. East Durham, historically black, continues to experience poverty rates and health outcomes that diverge sharply from the city's aggregate statistics. The working-class economic mobility that the tobacco factory had, despite its exploitative conditions, actually provided a living wage, a regular paycheck, a path to home ownership without a college degree has not been replaced by anything offering equivalent accessibility. The Honey machine that arrived in 1962 is long gone. The 12,000 workers it displaced have mostly aged out of the workforce or died. Their children grew up in a Durham reshaped by their parents' displacement, and some of them are still there in neighborhoods where the primary economic memory is of a factory that once existed and doesn't anymore. There's something important in this story that gets lost when we frame it purely as a tale of corporate decisions and market forces. The American Tobacco Company didn't fail. It succeeded. It optimized. It made rational decisions that improved its financial performance and extended its operational viability in a declining market. Lucky Strike still exists. American brands became Fortune brands, diversified profitably, and its successor entities are trading on stock exchanges today. The cost of that success was borne by a city that never invoiced for it, by workers who had no mechanism to demand compensation for it, and by a community whose civic infrastructure was built on a foundation that could be withdrawn without notice and without obligation. The machines were too heavy to move. Everything else was not.